The frosty wind whistled through the empty streets as the city lights twinkled against the cold December sky. Christmas Eve was alive with the magic of the season. Families gathered around roaring fireplaces, children tucked in with dreams of gifts under glittering trees, and the sound of carolers echoed from one street to the next. But on a quiet corner of the city, beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp, a heartbreaking discovery would change the course of many lives forever. It was a night that seemed wrapped in hope and joy, yet the silence in that moment was deafening. The faint, muffled cries of a baby pierced the icy stillness, barely audible over the bustling noise of distant celebrations. Tucked into a worn blanket inside a cardboard box, a tiny baby, no more than a few hours old, lay abandoned on the steps of a small neighborhood church. The child's skin, as soft as velvet, bore a deep ebony tone that contrasted beautifully with the stark white of the snowfall. A note was pinned to the blanket, its handwriting shaky and rushed, revealing only 3 haunting words. "Please love her." Reverend Thomas, the aging caretaker of the church, was locking up after the evening service when he heard the cries. His heart sank as he stepped outside and spotted the fragile bundle in the snow. Kneeling down, he carefully picked up the box, shielding the baby from the biting wind. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice trembling, "who would leave such a precious soul alone on this holy night?" The Reverend wasted no time, bringing the child inside to warm her by the fire. He alerted the authorities, and soon the baby became the talk of the town. People speculated about her origins. Some wondered if she was the result of desperation, a mother unable to care for her child. Others whispered rumors that only deepened the mystery of the abandoned infant. But one thing was certain: her life had started with unimaginable heartbreak. She was named Faith by the nurses at the hospital who cared for her in those early days, a name that symbolized the hope and resilience she would carry throughout her life. Faith's journey was far from easy. Growing up in the foster care system, she faced challenges no child should ever endure. Yet, despite the odds, she developed a strength and kindness that made her stand out from others. But why was she abandoned? Who were her parents? And what would become of a girl left on the coldest night of the year? Faith's life was a tapestry of questions without answers, and it wasn't until she grew older that the true significance of her story began to unfold. Her struggles were the foundation for something extraordinary, something no one could have predicted that fateful night. Years later, when Faith had grown into a young woman, a twist of fate led her to a moment that would define her life. It was a chance encounter, one that brought her face to face with her past and propelled her toward a future she could never have imagined. But what was that moment? What had Faith discovered about herself? And how did an abandoned baby, left to the mercy of the winter chill, become a beacon of hope for countless lives? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. Faith's journey is one of heartbreak, resilience, and ultimate redemption. A story that reminds us that even the coldest night can give birth to a light that warms the world. Faith's childhood was marked by transitions, moving from one foster home to another, each with its own set of challenges. Some homes offered her love and stability, while others only deepened her feelings of abandonment. She often wondered about the woman who had left her that night. What had driven her to make such a choice? Did she regret it? Did she think of Faith? These unanswered questions became the silent companions of her childhood, shaping her into someone who longed for connection but feared rejection. Despite her turbulent upbringing, Faith had an unyielding spirit. She was bright, curious, and compassionate, traits that seemed to bloom even in the harshest conditions. Teachers noticed her determination, her willingness to help others, and her uncanny ability to see the good in people. But life wasn't kind to Faith, and the world didn't always return the kindness she offered. One pivotal moment came when Faith was 12 years old. She had been placed with a family that, on the surface, seemed perfect, a cheerful couple with warm smiles and promises of a stable home. For a while, it seemed like Faith might finally have found a place to belong. But cracks began to show, and once again, she was left feeling like an outsider. It wasn't their fault entirely. The scars of her past made it hard for her to trust, to believe she truly deserved love. By the time she entered her teens, Faith had learned to rely on herself. She found solace in books and school, immersing herself in stories of heroes who overcame impossible odds. These tales fueled her belief that she, too, could rise above her circumstances. Her love for learning didn't go unnoticed. One teacher, Mrs. Carter, saw the spark in Faith and encouraged her to dream bigger. "Your past doesn't define you," Mrs. Carter told her one day. "What you do with your future does." Those words stuck with Faith, becoming a mantra she repeated to herself during moments of doubt. They pushed her to work harder, to excel in her studies, and to seek opportunities that would take her beyond the boundaries of her upbringing. But even as she excelled academically, the questions about her past lingered. On nights when the world felt too heavy, she would sit by her bedroom window, staring at the stars, and wonder if her mother was looking at the same sky. Did she miss Faith? Was she out there somewhere, living a life free of the guilt of that Christmas Eve? Faith's yearning for answers grew stronger as she approached adulthood. With each passing year, the ache in her heart deepened, and she decided that one day, she would find out the truth. But life had other plans, and Faith soon found herself facing challenges she never could have anticipated. At 18, she aged out of the foster care system, a milestone that brought both freedom and uncertainty. With no family to lean on, she had to navigate the world on her own. She worked tirelessly, juggling multiple jobs while attending college. Her dream was to become a nurse, a career born from her desire to help others, to be the light in someone else's darkest moment. Faith's journey through nursing school was anything but easy, but her determination never wavered. She spent long nights studying and even longer days working at a diner to pay her bills. There were times when the weight of it all seemed unbearable, but she held on to the belief that her struggles had a purpose. And then, one fateful night during her clinical rotations at the hospital, Faith's life took a turn she never saw coming. A patient came into the emergency room, a woman in her late 40s, disoriented and weak. Faith was assigned to care for her, and from the moment she walked into the room, something felt different. The woman's eyes, though tired and filled with pain, held a familiarity that sent a shiver down Faith's spine. There was an unspoken connection, a sense that their lives were somehow intertwined. The woman's name was Grace, and as Faith cared for her over the next few days, the pieces of a puzzle began to fall into place. Pieces that would reveal a truth more extraordinary than Faith could have ever imagined. Grace, too, had her own story of loss and redemption, tone that intersected with Faith's in ways neither of them could have predicted. But the revelation of their connection wasn't just a moment of closure. It was the beginning of a journey that would lead Faith to fulfill a destiny far greater than herself. Who was Grace? What secrets did she hold? And how would their meeting change the course of both their lives? The answers lay in the unfolding chapters of Faith's story, a story of love, forgiveness, and the power of human connection. Stay tuned, because this tale is just beginning. What started as an abandoned baby on a cold Christmas Eve is about to transform into an inspiring journey of resilience, discovery, and the profound impact one life can have on the world. Over the next few days, Faith spent as much time as she could with Grace, attending to her medical needs and offering the kind of warmth and compassion she herself had often longed for in her darkest moments. There was something unspoken yet deeply familiar about Grace, a presence that tugged at the edges of Faith's memory, though she couldn't explain why. One evening, as the hospital's hum quieted and the world outside slipped into the stillness of night, Faith sat by Grace's bedside. The older woman, her frailty more evident in the dim glow of the room, seemed lost in thought. Her voice, raspy yet determined, broke the silence. "You remind me of someone," Grace said, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were searching for an image buried deep in her mind. Faith smiled softly. "Maybe I just have one of those faces." Grace chuckled faintly, but her expression quickly turned serious. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's something more." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, Faith felt a strange mix of hope and dread. What could Grace mean? Was it possible that their meeting wasn't just coincidence? As the days passed, Faith learned more about Grace's life. She had faced hardships of her own, loss, regret, and decisions that had haunted her for decades. Grace spoke in fragments, often hesitating, as if she feared revealing too much. But the more she shared, the more Faith felt an unshakable connection to this woman. Then, one evening, the truth began to unravel. Grace, her voice trembling with emotion, spoke of a moment from her past that had shaped her entire life. "It was years ago," she began, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I was young, scared, and alone. I made a choice, one I've regretted every single day since." Faith's heart pounded as she listened. Her instincts telling her this story was more than just a confession. It was a key to the questions she had carried all her life. "I had a daughter," Grace continued, tears streaming down her face. "But I wasn't ready. I couldn't care for her. And so, one cold Christmas Eve, I left her, hoping someone else would give her the life I couldn't." The room fell silent, the weight of Grace's words settling like a heavy blanket. Faith's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? Was this woman the mother she had spent her entire life wondering about? Grace turned to Faith, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and longing. I never stopped thinking about her, she whispered. Not a single day has passed where I didn't wonder if she was safe, if she was loved. Faith's hands trembled as she reached out, her voice barely audible. Grace, what was her name? Grace hesitated, her face crumpling under the weight of her emotions. I didn't name her, she admitted. I couldn't, but I left a note, asking whoever found her to love her. Tears streamed down Faith's face as the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. This woman, lying before her in the hospital bed, was her mother. The person she had dreamed of, cried for, and silently searched for all her life. But as much as this revelation brought clarity, it also stirred a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, gratitude, and confusion swirled within Faith, threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to demand answers, to ask why Grace had left her, but she also saw the pain and remorse etched into the older woman's face. In that moment, Faith made a decision that would define the next chapter of her life. She reached for Grace's hand and held it tightly. You found me now, she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears. And that's what matters. The reunion between mother and daughter was bittersweet, a mix of joy and sorrow that spoke to the complexities of their shared history. But it was also the beginning of a healing process for both of them. Grace's health began to improve, and as she grew stronger, so did her bond with Faith. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and filling the gaps in each other's lives. For the first time in years, Faith felt a sense of belonging, a connection to her past that gave her strength for the future. But this was not the end of Faith's journey. The lessons she had learned from her own struggles and her newfound relationship with Grace ignited a fire within her. She realized that her story had a purpose far greater than she had ever imagined. With Grace's encouragement, Faith began to channel her experiences into helping others. She became a fierce advocate for children in foster care, sharing her story to inspire hope and change. She organized support programs, worked with charities, and even started her own foundation dedicated to helping abandoned and at-risk children find the love and stability they deserved. Faith's journey had come full circle, from a baby left in the cold to a woman who brought warmth and light to countless lives. Her story, marked by pain and resilience, became a testament to the power of forgiveness, love, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. And while the scars of her past would never fully fade, they no longer defined her. Instead, they became a source of strength, a reminder that even the most broken beginnings can lead to extraordinary endings. As Christmas approached once again, Faith found herself standing outside the church where her story had begun so many years ago. Snowflakes danced in the air, and the faint sound of carolers echoed in the distance. She smiled, her heart full of gratitude and peace, knowing that the little girl left on Christmas Eve had not only found her place in the world, but had also created a legacy of love and hope that would endure for generations to come. Faith's story wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone she had touched, everyone she had saved, and everyone she had inspired to believe that even in the darkest moments, there is always a light waiting to shine. The days following the revelation of Grace's identity were a whirlwind for Faith. Her emotions were a complex web, each thread pulling her in a different direction. Relief mingled with confusion, gratitude tangled with hurt. While she had spent years dreaming of this moment, she hadn't anticipated the depth of the emotional storm that would follow. Faith found herself replaying Grace's confession over and over in her mind. The image of a young woman, terrified and desperate, leaving her baby on a cold Christmas Eve, haunted her. She tried to imagine what it must have been like for Grace, the fear, the guilt, and the heartbreak of walking away. And yet, even as she tried to understand, a small voice in the back of her mind kept asking, why? Why didn't you come back for me? Grace, too, was grappling with the weight of their reunion. She had carried the pain of that night for decades, convinced she would never have the chance to make things right. Now that Faith was here, alive and thriving, she felt an overwhelming mix of joy and guilt. The sight of Faith, so strong, so determined, only deepened her regret. What kind of life could they have shared if she had made a different choice? As the days turned into weeks, Faith and Grace tried to bridge the gap of lost time. They spent hours talking, cautiously peeling back the layers of their shared past. Grace told Faith about her childhood, her struggles as a young adult, and the circumstances that led to that fateful night. Faith listened, her heart aching as she heard the pain in Grace's voice. But not all questions had answers, and not all wounds could be healed with words. Faith wanted to believe that Grace's decision had been born out of love, but a part of her still felt the sting of abandonment. She wrestled with these feelings in silence, afraid to voice them and risk losing the fragile connection they had just begun to build. One night, as they sat in the small living room of Grace's modest apartment, Faith finally asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Why didn't you come back for me?" Grace looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I wanted to," she said softly. "Every day, I thought about it, but I was scared. I told myself you were better off without me, that you deserved a life I couldn't give you. And as the years went on, the guilt only grew. I didn't know if you would forgive me, if you'd even want to see me." Faith's throat tightened, her own tears threatening to spill. She wanted to tell Grace that she understood, that she forgave her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached for Grace's hand and held it tightly, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both carried. As they navigated the complexities of their newfound relationship, another layer of mystery began to emerge. Grace mentioned fleeting details about her life in the years following Faith's birth, vague references to people and events that didn't quite add up. Faith couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something Grace wasn't telling her. Her suspicions deepened when she found an old, weathered journal tucked away in a box of Grace's belongings. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, some neat and deliberate, others scribbled in haste. Faith hesitated before opening it, unsure if she had the right to delve into Grace's private thoughts. But curiosity and a longing for answers won out. The journal offered glimpses into Grace's life before and after that Christmas Eve. It detailed her struggles with poverty, her dreams of a better future, and the heartbreak of having to give up her child. But as Faith read further, she stumbled upon entries that hinted at a darker chapter in Grace's life. Mentions of a man named Robert, cryptic references to threats and fear, and a recurring phrase that sent chills down her spine. "I had no choice," the words lingered in Faith's mind, raising questions she couldn't ignore. Who was Robert? What kind of danger had Grace faced? And how had it all led to her decision to leave Faith at the church? When Faith confronted Grace about the journal, the older woman grew visibly uneasy. She avoided Faith's gaze, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "There are things I haven't told you," Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things I'm not proud of." Grace's reluctance to share the full truth only fueled Faith's determination to uncover it. She began to piece together fragments of the story, searching for clues in the journal and pressing Grace for details whenever she could. The more she learned, the clearer it became that Grace's life had been shaped by forces far beyond her control. One entry in the journal stood out in particular. It described a night when Grace had been cornered by Robert, a man she described as both charming and dangerous. He had promised her the world but left her with nothing but fear and regret. The entry ended with a chilling sentence. "He said he'd find us if I ever tried to leave." Faith's heart raced as she read those words, her mind racing with possibilities. Had Robert been the reason Grace felt she had no choice but to leave her baby behind? Was he still out there, a shadow from the past that threatened to resurface? As these questions swirled in Faith's mind, a new tension began to creep into their lives. Strange phone calls disrupted their evenings, the line going silent whenever they answered. On more than one occasion, Faith felt as though she was being watched, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck that she couldn't shake. She tried to dismiss these feelings as paranoia, but the unease lingered. And then, one evening, she returned to Grace's apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, calling out for Grace. The living room was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor and a lamp knocked over. "Grace!" Faith's voice trembled as she searched the apartment. She found Grace in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with tears streaming down her face. In her hands was a crumpled piece of paper, the words scrawled across it sending a chill down Faith's spine. "You can't hide forever." The sight of the note confirmed Faith's worst fears. Whoever Robert was, he hadn't disappeared into the past. He was still out there, watching, waiting. As Faith held Grace in her arms, she made a silent vow. She had spent her entire life searching for answers, yearning for a connection to her past. Now that she had found it, she wasn't going to let anything take it away. But the danger lurking in the shadows was real, and the secrets of Grace's past were more complicated than Faith had ever imagined. The journey ahead would test their strength, their courage, and their bond. And as they prepared to face whatever lay ahead, one thing became clear. The story of an abandoned baby on Christmas Eve was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and fear. Faith couldn't shake the feeling of being on edge, and Grace's fragile demeanor only deepened her concern. The cryptic note left in the apartment had confirmed that their past wasn't as buried as they had hoped. Someone was watching, and their intentions were anything but benign. Faith knew they couldn't simply sit back and wait for whatever threat lingered to materialize. She convinced Grace to tell her more about Robert, though the older woman was hesitant. Sitting at the kitchen table one quiet evening, Grace finally began to open up, her voice trembling as she recounted the memories she had tried so hard to bury. Robert wasn't always like that, Grace began, her gaze fixed on her hands, which were clasped tightly together. At first, he was kind. He made me feel like I wasn't alone, like someone finally cared about me. But over time, his charm turned into control. He didn't just want to be with me. He wanted to own me. Faith listened intently, her heart breaking for the young, vulnerable version of Grace who had fallen under Robert's spell. What happened? She asked gently. Grace sighed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the memories. I tried to leave him, but he wouldn't let me go. When I found out I was pregnant with you, I thought maybe it would change things, that he'd see a reason to be better. But it only made things worse. He became paranoid, accusing me of trying to take you away from him before you were even born. A lump formed in Faith's throat as she imagined the fear Grace must have felt. Is that why you left me at the church? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. I didn't know if I'd survive if I stayed, but I couldn't risk him finding you. Leaving you there was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I believed it was the only chance you had for a life free from him. Faith reached across the table and took Grace's trembling hands in her own. You did what you thought was best, she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. But now we need to figure out how to keep both of us safe. Grace looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and fear in her eyes. I don't want to drag you into this, Faith. You've already been through so much because of me. You're my family, Faith replied firmly, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, or me. We'll face this together. With that resolve, Faith decided it was time to take action. She began digging deeper into Grace's past, determined to uncover everything she could about Robert. The journal provided some leads, names of places and people that might hold clues to his whereabouts or intentions. Faith also reached out to a trusted friend from her volunteer work at the shelter, a retired detective named Sam, who agreed to help. Sam listened carefully as Faith explained the situation, his brow furrowed in concern. If this guy is still around and making threats, we need to act fast, he said. Do you have any idea where he might be, or how he's tracking you? Faith shook her head. We're not sure, but he seems to know where we are. He left a note at Grace's apartment. Sam frowned. That's bold. He's trying to intimidate you. But people like that thrive on fear. The best thing you can do is not give him the reaction he wants. With Sam's guidance, Faith and Grace took steps to protect themselves. They changed the locks on the apartment, installed security cameras, and filed a report with the local police. Sam also advised them to keep a low profile, avoiding any predictable routines that could make them easy to track. Despite these precautions, the sense of unease lingered. Faith found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her heart racing at the slightest unexpected noise. Grace, too, seemed more withdrawn, her usually warm demeanor overshadowed by the weight of her past. One evening, as Faith was sorting through old photographs and documents in an attempt to piece together more of Grace's story, she came across a faded photograph tucked inside the journal. It showed a younger Grace, her smile radiant despite the tiredness in her eyes. Beside her stood a man with sharp features and an intense gaze, Robert. Faith stared at the photo, her stomach twisting with a mix of anger and curiosity. This was the man who had caused so much pain, the shadow that still loomed over their lives. She couldn't help but wonder where he was now and what his intentions were. As she continued searching through the box, she found another clue, a letter written in Robert's handwriting. The tone was both possessive and threatening, filled with promises of retribution if Grace ever left him. One line in particular sent chills down her spine. You'll never be free of me, no matter how far you run. Faith showed the letter to Sam the next day, and his expression grew even more serious. This guy doesn't just sound dangerous, he sounds obsessed, he said. We need to figure out if he's still in the area and what he might be planning. The following weeks were a delicate balance of caution and investigation. Sam used his connections to dig into Robert's background, uncovering a trail of troubling behavior that confirmed he was a man who thrived on control and intimidation. Meanwhile, Faith and Grace focused on rebuilding their relationship, finding moments of joy and connection amid the uncertainty. But the danger was never far from their minds. One night, as Faith was returning to the apartment after running an errand, she noticed a car parked across the street with its headlights off. The driver's silhouette was barely visible, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her instincts kicked in, and she quickly walked past the apartment building, pretending she hadn't noticed the car. She circled back through a side alley and entered the building through a back entrance, her heart pounding. Once inside, she immediately called Sam and told him what she had seen. "That's not a coincidence," Sam said. "We'll need to keep an eye out for that car. If you see it again, let me know immediately." The tension continued to build, each new development adding another layer of uncertainty to their lives. And as Faith lay awake that night, her mind racing with questions and fears, she couldn't help but wonder, was this just the beginning of something far more dangerous? The next morning brought a heavy fog that mirrored the unease in Faith's mind. Grace sat at the kitchen table, cradling a cup of tea between her hands. The shadows under her eyes spoke of another sleepless night. Faith poured herself some coffee, trying to ignore the knot of tension in her stomach. Every creak of the apartment seemed louder, every moment of silence more oppressive. "I saw the car again," Faith finally said, breaking the quiet. "It was parked outside when I got back last night." Grace's hands trembled slightly, spilling a few drops of tea onto the table. "What if it's him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Faith leaned closer, lowering her own voice as if speaking louder might summon the danger they both feared. "I don't know, but Sam said he'd look into it. We'll figure this out, Grace." Though her words were meant to reassure, they felt hollow. The truth was, Faith didn't know if they could protect themselves from someone as determined and unpredictable as Robert. The feeling of being hunted weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the danger that loomed. Later that day, Sam called with news. He'd run a check on the license plate of the car Faith had seen. "It's a rental," he said. "No name tied to it yet, but the rental company's records might give us more to work with. I'm following up." Faith felt a flicker of hope at his words, but it was quickly extinguished by the sound of a sharp knock at the door. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she froze, glancing at Grace, who looked equally alarmed. "Stay here," Faith whispered, grabbing her phone as she made her way cautiously toward the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw a delivery man standing there, holding a bouquet of white roses. She opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "These are for a Miss Grace," the man said, holding out the flowers. Faith hesitated before accepting them. The bouquet was beautiful, but something about it felt wrong. She thanked the delivery man and closed the door, locking it behind her. When she brought the flowers to the kitchen, Grace's face turned pale. Tucked inside the bouquet was a small envelope. Faith opened it carefully, pulling out a card that read, "Asterisk thinking of you. Always watching." Asterisk the room seemed to close in around them as the weight of the message sank in. "This isn't just intimidation," Sam said when Faith called to tell him what had happened. "He's trying to show that he's in control, that he can get to you whenever he wants. We need to take this seriously." Sam advised them to stay somewhere else for a few days while he worked to track down more information on Robert. Grace reluctantly agreed, and they packed a few essentials before heading to a safe house Sam had arranged through one of his contacts. It was a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet neighborhood, but even there, Faith couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As they settled in, Grace opened up more about the years she had spent on the run. She told Faith about the times she'd had to change her name, move to different cities, and start over completely. She spoke of the loneliness, the fear, and the constant guilt of leaving her baby behind. "I always thought he'd find me eventually," Grace admitted, her voice breaking. "I just hoped I'd have enough time to make sure you were safe." Faith listened, her heart aching for the sacrifices Grace had made. "You don't have to run anymore," she said softly. "We'll face this together." But as much as Faith wanted to believe her own words, the days ahead proved more challenging than she could have imagined. Sam uncovered more about Robert's recent activities, including reports of him hiring private investigators to track down Grace. It was clear he wasn't going to give up easily. Meanwhile, Faith began noticing small but unsettling signs that they weren't as hidden as they thought. A man lingering too long outside the apartment building. A missed call from an unknown number. The sense of being followed when she went out to buy groceries. Grace, too, seemed increasingly on edge. One evening, Faith found her staring out the window, clutching a small photo frame in her hands. It held a picture of the two of them taken when they had first reunited. "I can't lose you again," Grace said, her voice trembling. "I won't let him take you away." "You won't?" Faith assured her, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The breaking point came one night when a loud knock startled them both out of sleep. This time, it wasn't a delivery man. Sam had arrived, his expression grim. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." "What's going on?" Faith asked, her pulse racing. Sam hesitated, his eyes darting to Grace before returning to Faith. We found out who rented that car. It's connected to one of Robert's associates, a man who's been known to do his dirty work. He's close, and we can't risk staying here." In a flurry of movement, they packed their belongings and followed Sam out the back entrance of the building. The air was heavy with tension as they made their way to an unmarked car parked a few blocks away. As they drove through the quiet streets, Faith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror felt like a threat. Every turn an opportunity for danger to catch up to them. The destination Sam had arranged was another safe house, this one even more secluded. It was a small cabin on the outskirts of a forest, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to swallow the light. Though it was meant to be a place of safety, the isolation only heightened the sense of vulnerability. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. Sam handed Faith the burner phone. "Use this if you need to contact me," he said. "Don't answer any calls or text from numbers you don't recognize. And don't leave unless it's absolutely necessary." As he left, the weight of their situation settled over Faith and Grace like a heavy blanket. They were safe for now, but the threat was far from over. And somewhere out there, Robert, or someone working for him, was getting closer. The quiet of the cabin felt oppressive as night fell. Faith sat by the window, staring out at the dense forest that surrounded them. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting eerie shadows against the walls. Grace was in the small bedroom, lying down but not sleeping. Faith could tell by the creak of the mattress every time she shifted. Faith's mind raced with unanswered questions. How long could they keep running? How much longer before Robert found them? And what would he do when he did? Every noise outside, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, made her heart pound. At some point, she heard Grace's soft voice behind her. "Can't sleep?" Faith turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "No," Faith admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel like he's here, watching us." Grace nodded, her expression weary. "I know the feeling. I've lived with it for years." They sat together in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually, Grace spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I've kept from you." Faith looked at her, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. "What is it?" Grace hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "The night I left you, it wasn't just about keeping you safe. It was also about protecting something else. Something Robert was desperate to find." Faith's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Before you were born, Robert was involved in things, illegal things. Money laundering, smuggling, things I didn't fully understand until it was too late. But there was one thing he was after more than anything else, a ledger. It contained names, transactions, evidence that could bring down everyone he was working with. I didn't know about it until I accidentally found it one day." Faith's eyes widened. "And you took it?" "I didn't have a choice," Grace said, her voice shaking. "I knew if I didn't, he'd use it to hurt more people, to consolidate his power. I hid it in a place only I knew about. When I realized he'd do anything to get it back, I knew I had to disappear, and I couldn't risk taking you with me. He would have used you against me." The weight of her mother's confession hit Faith like a tidal wave. "So all of this, it's because of that ledger?" Grace nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He doesn't care about me, Faith. He never did. But he knows I'm the only one who can lead him to it." Faith felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "Then why haven't you turned it over to the authorities? Why keep it hidden?" "I tried," Grace said, her voice breaking. "But every time I got close, Robert was one step ahead. He has people everywhere, cops, lawyers, even politicians. If I hand it over, there's no guarantee it won't end up back in his hands." Faith leaned back in her chair, trying to process everything. The story had taken a darker turn than she'd expected. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to a man who had caused so much pain. The next morning, Sam called with an update. "We've got a lead," he said. "One of Robert's associates was spotted in a nearby town. He's been asking questions, looking for Grace." Faith relayed the information to her mother, who seemed to grow paler with every word. "He's closing in," Grace said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep running forever," Faith said. "Maybe it's time to fight back." Grace looked at her, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. "You don't know what he's capable of." "No," Faith said firmly, "but I know what we're capable of. And we're stronger than he thinks." Sam agreed to meet them later that day to discuss their next move. In the meantime, Faith and Grace began going through old documents and photos, hoping to find anything that might help them gain the upper hand. As they worked, Faith noticed a change in her mother, a spark of the courage that had kept her going all these years. By the time Sam arrived, the tension in the cabin was palpable. He spread out a map on the table, marking the locations where Robert's men had been spotted. "We've got a narrow window to act," he said. "If we can get to the ledger before they do, we might be able to turn the tide." Grace hesitated. "It's not far from here," she said quietly, "but it's risky. He'll have people watching." Faith placed a hand on her mother's shoulder. "We'll figure it out together." As night fell once again, the plan began to take shape. They would move under the cover of darkness, using back roads to avoid detection. Sam would provide backup, but the bulk of the plan rested on Faith and Grace's shoulders. The tension between them was unspoken but heavy. This was their chance to end the nightmare, but it came with no guarantees. The stakes had never been higher, and the shadows outside seemed to grow darker with every passing moment. And somewhere, out there in the night, Robert was waiting. As they finalized the details, a heavy silence settled over the cabin. Faith could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on her chest. Grace sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a mixture of fear and determination. Sam double-checked the map, marking out alternate routes and emergency exits, his calm demeanor doing little to ease the tension. "Remember," Sam said, breaking the silence, "the goal is to get in, retrieve the ledger, and get out without being seen. We can't risk a confrontation. If Robert or his men spot you, the plan is over." Faith nodded, though her heart was pounding. She had never been in a situation like this before, never faced danger so directly. But as she looked at her mother, she knew she couldn't back down. Grace had carried this burden alone for far too long. It was time for Faith to step up. As midnight approached, they set out. The air was crisp and cold, the forest around them eerily silent. Faith drove, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, while Grace gave quiet directions. Sam followed in his own car a short distance behind, his headlights off to avoid drawing attention. The drive felt like it lasted an eternity, each bend in the road bringing a new wave of anxiety. Faith's mind raced with questions. What if they were caught? What if the ledger was gone? What if Robert had already found it? She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the road ahead. Finally, they arrived at an old, abandoned farmhouse. It was a place Faith had never seen before, but Grace seemed to recognize it immediately. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ledger is hidden in the basement." Faith parked the car behind a cluster of trees, out of sight from the road. Sam pulled up moments later, stepping out and scanning the area with a flashlight. "No signs of anyone yet," he said, "but we need to move fast." They approached the house cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. The farmhouse loomed in the darkness, its windows broken and its paint peeling. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but Faith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Grace led the way inside, her movements careful and deliberate. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. "The basement entrance is in the kitchen," she said, guiding them through the dimly lit rooms. When they reached the kitchen, Grace hesitated. She knelt down and began feeling around the edges of a large, dusty rug. "Help me move this," she said, glancing at Faith. Together, they pulled the rug aside, revealing a wooden trapdoor. Grace knelt down and pried it open, revealing a set of rickety stairs leading into the darkness below. "It's down there," she said, her voice trembling. Faith peered into the blackness, her stomach twisting. "Are you sure it's safe?" Grace nodded. "It has to be." Sam stayed upstairs, keeping watch, while Faith and Grace descended into the basement. The air was damp and cold, and the faint smell of earth filled the space. Grace moved with purpose, guiding Faith to a far corner of the room. There, hidden behind an old, rusted cabinet, was a small metal box. "This is it," Grace said, her voice barely audible. Faith helped her pull the box out, her hands trembling. The lock on the box was old and rusted, but Grace produced a key from her pocket. As she opened it, Faith held her breath. Inside was a worn leather ledger, its pages yellowed with age. Grace flipped through it quickly, her eyes scanning the contents. "It's all here," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Everything we need to take Robert down." Before they could celebrate, a noise upstairs froze them in place. A sharp creak, followed by the sound of footsteps. Faith's heart stopped. She looked at Grace, who mouthed one word. "Run," clutching the ledger tightly. They made their way back to the stairs as quietly as possible. Sam was waiting at the top, his face pale. "We've got company," he whispered. 2 cars just pulled up outside. Faith's mind raced. They were trapped. The farmhouse had no back exit, and the cars blocked the road they had come in on. Grace's face was a mask of fear, but she clutched the ledger tightly, refusing to let it go. "What do we do?" Faith whispered. Sam glanced out the window, his expression grim. "We wait, and we hope they don't find us before we find a way out." The sound of voices outside grew louder, and Faith could make out Robert's unmistakable tone. He was here, and he wasn't alone. Faith's pulse thundered in her ears as she crouched low by the staircase, clutching the worn leather ledger tightly against her chest. Grace was beside her, breathing shallowly, her face pale but set with determination. Sam moved toward the front of the house, peering cautiously through the cracked curtains. Outside, the voices grew closer, and heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway. Robert's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Spread out. Search the perimeter. They're here somewhere. I can feel it." Sam turned back to them, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've got flashlights. They're checking every corner. We don't have much time." Faith swallowed hard, her mind racing. There was no way out without being seen, and staying hidden seemed impossible. She felt an overwhelming wave of fear, but when she looked at Grace, she saw something else: resolve. Her mother had been running from this man for years, but she hadn't given up, and neither would Faith. "What do we do?" Faith whispered urgently. Grace reached out, placing a steadying hand on her daughter's arm. "We can't let him get this," she said, nodding toward the ledger. "No matter what happens, this has to stay out of his hands." Sam knelt beside them, his jaw tight. "We'll have to create a distraction, something to draw them away. If we can get them to focus on one area, you two might have a chance to slip out through the back." "There's no back door," Faith said, panic creeping into her voice. Sam frowned, thinking quickly. "The basement. If there's a window down there, it might be your only shot." Grace hesitated, glancing at the trapdoor they had just emerged from. "It's risky. Those windows are small, and they'll hear us if we break the glass." "Not if they're distracted," Sam said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flare. "I'll set this off near the edge of the woods. It'll buy you some time." Before anyone could protest, Sam stood and slipped toward the front of the house, staying low to avoid being seen. Grace and Faith watched him go, their hearts in their throats. The voices outside were louder now, and flashlight beams danced across the broken windows. "Come on," Grace whispered, tugging Faith toward the trapdoor. They descended into the basement once again, the air even colder and damper than before. Faith scanned the walls, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the far corner, she spotted a small, dirt-smeared window just above ground level. It was covered with rusted bars. "Great," she muttered, her voice tinged with despair. Grace moved quickly, examining the bars. "They're old. If we can pry them loose..." Faith searched the room, her hands shaking, until she found a heavy iron pipe. She handed it to Grace, who began wedging it between the bars and the frame, using all her strength to pry them loose. The sound of metal scraping against wood echoed through the basement, and Faith winced, praying it wouldn't draw attention. Suddenly, the sound of shouting erupted outside. A brilliant red light flared up, illuminating the trees. Sam's distraction had worked. The voices moved away from the house, and the footsteps grew fainter. "Hurry," Faith urged, her voice trembling. With a final heave, Grace managed to break the bars free. She pushed the window open, and cold night air rushed in. "You first," she said, motioning for Faith to climb through. Faith hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Grace promised. "Go." Faith squeezed through the narrow opening, the rough edges scraping against her arms and legs. She tumbled out onto the damp ground, gasping for breath. Moments later, Grace emerged, clutching the ledger tightly. They crouched low, listening for any sign of pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet now, the distant crackle of the flare the only sound. Faith looked toward the farmhouse, her heart sinking. Sam was still inside. "We can't leave him," she whispered. Grace shook her head, her face etched with anguish. "We don't have a choice. He knew the risks." Faith wanted to argue, but there was no time. A sudden shout from the direction of the driveway sent her heart racing. "They're over here," a voice yelled. "Run," Grace said, grabbing Faith's hand. They took off into the forest, the ledger tucked tightly under Grace's arm. Branches whipped against their faces, and the uneven ground threatened to trip them with every step. Flashlight beams cut through the trees behind them, the voices of their pursuers growing louder. Faith's lungs burned as they ran, but she didn't dare slow down. Grace was surprisingly fast, her grip on Faith's hand unrelenting. They weaved through the trees, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the men chasing them. Finally, they reached a small stream. Grace paused, her chest heaving, and motioned for Faith to follow her into the water. "It'll mask our tracks," she said. They waded through the icy water, the cold seeping through their shoes and numbing their feet. Faith's teeth chattered, but she kept moving, her mother's determination spurring her on. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. They climbed out of the stream and collapsed onto the muddy bank, gasping for air. "We can't stop," Grace said, her voice hoarse. "Not yet." Faith nodded, forcing herself to her feet. Her body ached, and every muscle screamed for rest. But she knew her mother was right. They weren't safe, not yet. As they stumbled deeper into the forest, Faith couldn't help but think of Sam. She prayed he had found a way out, that he hadn't sacrificed himself for nothing. But there was no time to dwell on it. For now, all that mattered was staying ahead of Robert and keeping the ledger safe. The forest around them grew darker, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. Faith's fear began to creep back in, but she pushed it down, focusing on each step forward. Somewhere out there, Robert was still hunting them. But for the first time, Faith felt a spark of hope. They had the ledger. They had a chance to fight back. And she wasn't going to let that chance slip away. The forest seemed endless as Faith and Grace trudged deeper into its shadowy depths. The moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy of trees, leaving them in near total darkness. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs sent their hearts racing. The ledger felt heavier with each passing moment, as though it carried the weight of all the secrets they had uncovered, and all the danger that followed them. Grace's grip on Faith's hand tightened as they stumbled over roots and uneven ground. The cold, damp air wrapped around them, chilling them to the bone. Faith's breath came in ragged gasps, her body screaming for rest, but she pushed on, fueled by the desperation in her mother's eyes. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Behind them, the faint sound of voices echoed through the trees. Robert's men were relentless, closing in despite Sam's brave distraction. Faith's stomach twisted at the thought of what might have happened to him. She couldn't shake the image of him standing in the farmhouse, flare in hand, as they slipped away. Guilt gnawed at her, but she forced it down. Sam had made his choice, and now it was up to them to make it count. "We need to find higher ground," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Faith's heart. "If we can see where they are, we might be able to lose them." Faith nodded, though the thought of climbing anything in her exhausted state seemed impossible. Still, she followed her mother as they veered off the main path and began ascending a rocky incline. The sharp edges of the rocks cut into their hands as they climbed, but neither of them dared to slow down. The voices were closer now, and the beams of flashlights danced through the trees below. When they finally reached the top of the hill, they collapsed onto the ground, panting. From their vantage point, they could see the faint glow of the farmhouse in the distance. Figures moved through the forest, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies. Robert's men were spreading out, combing the area with ruthless precision. Grace pulled Faith close, her voice trembling but firm. "We can't let them corner us. If they catch us with this ledger, they won't," Faith said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "We won't let them." Grace looked at her daughter, a flicker of pride in her eyes. But before she could respond, a sudden noise shattered the fragile quiet. A dog barking, sharp and relentless. Faith's blood ran cold. "They brought dogs," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Grace's face paled. "We have to move. Now." They scrambled to their feet and began running again, the ground sloping downward in a treacherous descent. The barking grew louder, accompanied by the crashing of underbrush as the dogs and their handlers closed in. Faith's lungs burned with every breath, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But the fear of being caught propelled her forward. As they ran, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and gnarled like something out of a nightmare. Faith's mind raced, searching for a way out, a place to hide. But the dogs were too close, their barks echoing through the night like a relentless drumbeat. Suddenly, Grace grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a large hollow tree. "In here," she whispered urgently. "We'll wait for them to pass." Faith hesitated for only a moment before climbing inside the narrow hollow. It was cramped and dark, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and earth. Grace squeezed in beside her, clutching the ledger tightly against her chest. They held their breath, listening as the barking and shouting grew louder. The search party was close now, so close that Faith could hear the crunch of boots on the forest floor and the low murmur of voices. She pressed herself against the rough wood, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they would hear it. A flashlight beam swept across the tree, illuminating the hollow for a split second. Faith froze, her body rigid with fear. But the beam moved on, and the footsteps continued past them. The barking began to fade, and for a moment, Faith dared to hope they had been overlooked. But then, a voice called out, sharp and authoritative. Spread out. Check everything. They couldn't have gone far. Faith's stomach sank. They weren't safe yet. Grace leaned in close, her lips barely moving as she whispered, We'll wait until they're farther away. Then we'll head for the river. The current is strong enough to carry our scent. Faith nodded, though the thought of wading into the freezing water made her shiver. She would do whatever it took to stay ahead of Robert and his men. She had to. Minutes felt like hours as they crouched in the hollow tree. The tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The sounds of the search party ebbed and flowed, sometimes alarmingly close, other times fading into the distance. Finally, Grace gave a small nod, signaling it was time to move. They slipped out of the hollow as quietly as they could, their movements slow and deliberate. The forest was eerily silent now, the barking and shouting replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was almost too quiet, and Faith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They moved quickly but cautiously, heading in the direction of the river. The terrain was rough, and every step felt like a test of their endurance. Faith's feet were numb, her body aching from head to toe, but she kept going, fueled by a mixture of fear and determination. When they finally reached the river, the sound of rushing water was both a relief and a new source of dread. The current was fast and unforgiving, churning over rocks and fallen branches. Grace didn't hesitate, stepping into the icy water without a second thought. Faith followed, the cold shocking her system and making her gasp. They waded into the middle of the river, the water up to their waists, and began moving downstream. The current tugged at them with alarming force, and Faith struggled to keep her footing. But the river was their only chance to throw off the dogs, and she wasn't about to give up now. As they moved through the water, the forest on either side seemed to close in, the darkness pressing down on them. Faith's mind raced with questions and fears. Would they make it to safety? What had become of Sam? And what would happen if Robert caught up to them? But there was no time for answers. The river carried them forward, deeper into the unknown, as the search party continued their relentless pursuit. The tension was unbearable, the outcome uncertain, and somewhere in the distance, a single flashlight beam pierced the darkness, a reminder that their fight was far from over. The beam of light cut through the dark forest like a beacon, sending a ripple of panic through Faith's chest. Her heart hammered in her throat as she struggled to keep her footing in the fast-moving river. The cold water swirled around her, pulling at her legs with each step. She glanced over at Grace, whose face was set with a grim determination. Despite the danger, her mother's composure was unwavering, and it steadied Faith's racing thoughts, if only for a moment. The river's current seemed to grow stronger as they moved downstream, the water crashing over rocks and branches with an almost menacing force. Faith's eyes darted to the shore, half expecting to see the silhouette of one of Robert's men waiting for them. But the shadows remained still, and for the moment, they were hidden by the thick darkness that swallowed them whole. Still, the sound of footsteps on the bank was unmistakable, crunching leaves, branches snapping. It was like the search party was drawing closer, inch by agonizing inch. Faith's stomach twisted with fear, and she stole a quick glance at Grace. Her mother was looking ahead, her face taut with concentration, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "We can't stay in the water much longer," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible over the rush of the river. "If they have dogs, they'll pick up our scent soon enough." Faith nodded, though she wasn't sure she had the strength to climb out of the water just yet. The thought of being caught, of losing the only lead they had to uncovering Robert's secrets, was too much to bear. She couldn't let that happen, not after everything they had been through. But Grace was right. The river couldn't protect them forever. The night was growing colder, and every muscle in Faith's body screamed for rest. The air felt heavier, like a storm was brewing, both in the world around them and within her. "We have to move fast," Grace urged, as if reading Faith's thoughts. She pulled her daughter forward, urging her toward the opposite bank. The current was stronger here, and the rocks underfoot were slippery, but Grace's grip was firm, and Faith clung to her as they fought their way toward the shore. Finally, they reached the edge of the river. Faith felt a surge of relief as her feet hit the solid ground, but it was quickly replaced by the sound of a low growl, a dog's growl. Her blood ran cold. It was too late. They had been spotted. The trees along the bank parted, and Faith's breath hitched as a tall figure emerged from the darkness, followed by a large, snarling dog. The animal's eyes glowed with a predatory gleam, its muscles rippling as it stalked closer. "Stay back," the man barked, his voice low and gravelly. "I'll handle this." Faith's mind raced. Was this one of Robert's men? Or was it someone else entirely? There was no time to think. She turned to Grace, who was already moving, pulling her away from the dog's sight. They had no weapons, no tools to defend themselves, just the ledger, the thing Robert would kill to get his hands on. Grace led them toward a thicket of trees, their branches thick enough to offer some cover. Faith's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline surging through her veins. But she knew they had to keep moving, had to find a way to escape before Robert's men caught up to them. The dog's growl grew louder as it padded toward them, its nostrils flaring as it scented the air. Faith's pulse quickened. They didn't have much time. She glanced around desperately, her eyes scanning for any sign of escape. The trees, the bushes, the thick forest. It was all a maze to her, each turn feeling like a trap. Suddenly, Grace stopped. Her eyes locked on something in the distance, something that made her stiffen. Faith followed her gaze, and her heart skipped a beat. A figure stood in the shadows, barely visible through the trees. But it was a figure Faith knew all too well. It was Sam. His face was hard, unreadable, as he stood still, watching them from the shadows. His dark clothes blended into the night, but his eyes, those eyes, seemed to glow with intensity. He wasn't alone. Two other figures stood behind him, equally silent, equally still. The tension was palpable. Faith froze, torn between relief and disbelief. Sam had found them. But why hadn't he come to help them sooner? Was this another trap? Grace stepped forward cautiously, her hand still clutching the ledger, her fingers white-knuckled. "Sam," she called, her voice tentative but loud enough to carry through the silence. "Is that really you?" For a long moment, there was no answer. Then, finally, Sam spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you, but we need to move. Robert's men are closing in." Faith's heart skipped a beat. It was him. Sam was really here, and he wasn't part of Robert's group anymore. But how? Faith started, her voice trembling. "I was never with them." Sam cut in, his eyes sharp, though his tone was gentle. "I was trying to warn you. Trying to get you out of there before it was too late." His words didn't immediately make sense to Faith. What did he mean, trying to warn them? Why had he stayed behind at the farmhouse, setting the trap with the flare? Why had he risked everything for them, only to disappear into the night? Sam seemed to sense her confusion, his eyes softening. "I knew they were watching me. I knew they would come for you eventually, but I had to make sure you were far enough away first." Faith's mind raced. She wanted to believe him, to trust that Sam had only been looking out for them. But her gut twisted with uncertainty. There was still so much she didn't know about Sam's loyalties, so much that didn't add up. The sound of the dogs barking in the distance jolted her from her thoughts. Robert's men were getting closer. "We don't have time for this," Grace said sharply, pulling Faith's attention back to the present. "We need to go now." Sam nodded, his expression grim. "Follow me. I know a way out." As they moved quickly through the forest, Faith's thoughts churned. Was Sam truly on their side? Or was he leading them into a trap? The only thing she knew for certain was that the stakes were higher than ever. If they didn't escape now, there might not be a second chance. And as the forest around them seemed to close in, Faith couldn't help but feel like they were being watched from every direction. The thick underbrush scraped against Faith's legs as they hurried through the dense forest, their breath ragged in the cold night air. Sam led them without a word, his movements calculated and purposeful. The eerie sound of distant barking echoed, getting closer with every passing second, reminding them how little time they had left. Faith's mind raced as she tried to piece together everything that had happened. Sam's sudden appearance, his cryptic words about being on their side, and his insistence that they follow him. It all felt too convenient. Could he really be trusted? What if he was working with Robert, using this moment to lure them into a trap? But something in her gut told her there was more to the story, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more disorienting it became. The trees seemed to close in on them, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves, but the bark of the dogs grew louder, closer. It was only a matter of time before they would be found. Suddenly, Sam stopped. He turned sharply, holding up a hand to signal for them to be quiet. Faith's pulse quickened as she strained to listen, her heart thumping in her chest. Had they been discovered? The air felt heavier now, thick with tension. A low growl rippled through the forest, coming from an unexpected direction. Faith's breath caught in her throat as she realized the dogs weren't the only threat. Something else was out there. Something worse. Before she could say anything, Sam whispered urgently, "Stay low. Don't move." Grace immediately pulled Faith down behind a thick cluster of bushes. Faith's heart pounded in her ears as she tried to peer through the leaves, straining to see what Sam had spotted. And then she saw it. Emerging from the darkness, moving with unnatural grace, was a figure. A tall, cloaked shadow that seemed to glide silently through the trees. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, like a predator stalking its prey. Faith's stomach dropped. She had seen those eyes before. It was Robert. But there was something different about him now. The man she had known all her life was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating figure with an air of danger that sent a shiver down her spine. He was no longer just a figure in her past. Now he was the very reason she was running for her life. Faith's mind spun. How had he found them so quickly? Had he been tracking them this whole time? Had Sam known this would happen? The questions came faster than she could process them, each one more urgent than the last. Then, as if to confirm her worst fears, a voice called out from the darkness. "I know you're here, Faith. There's no use hiding." It was Robert's voice, smooth and menacing, filled with an eerie calm that made her blood run cold. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even rushing. He was playing a game, and they were his prey. Faith's grip tightened on the edge of the bushes as she tried to keep her breathing steady. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, but where could she go? The forest felt like a maze, and Robert's men were closing in fast. The dogs would soon pick up their scent, and once they did, there would be no escaping. "Don't listen to him." Sam's voice cut through the tension. His eyes locked on Robert with a fierce intensity. "He's trying to manipulate you." Faith turned to Sam, her eyes wide. "What do you mean? What's happening? What's Robert really after?" But before Sam could answer, a sharp crack split the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping under heavy footsteps. Another figure emerged from the trees, this one larger, broader, unmistakably human but with an unsettling aura. It wasn't Robert, but someone just as dangerous. Faith's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a rescue mission. They were walking into a trap, one so elaborate it had been months in the making. And the worst part? They had no idea who they could trust. The man standing in front of them now was unfamiliar to Faith. He was dressed in dark tactical gear, his face hidden behind a mask, his movements calculated and deliberate. "You thought you could escape, but you're wrong," he said, his voice deep, clipped. He raised his hand, signaling the dogs to move forward. "We've been watching you for a long time. All of you." Faith's heart lurched in her chest. These weren't just random mercenaries working for Robert. This was something bigger, something much darker. The figure's words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. "You've been playing right into our hands. Every step, every move. It was all part of the plan." The realization hit Faith like a physical blow. The man's voice, there was something unsettlingly familiar about it. Her mind scrambled to place it, but it was like a shadow in the back of her mind, just out of reach. Sam stiffened beside her, his expression hardening. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You have no idea what's at stake here." But the masked man just smirked, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Oh, I understand perfectly. It's you who doesn't know what's at stake. You think you're protecting something, but you're wrong. You're just pawns in a much larger game." The words sent a chill through Faith. What game was he talking about? And who else was involved? The realization was dawning on her that this was no longer just about survival. This was about something far more sinister. As the man moved closer, his eyes never leaving Sam, Faith felt the air grow heavier, thick with unspoken secrets. There was more to this than just Robert's vendetta. This was about something larger, a conspiracy that had been woven together with careful precision. She had to know more. She had to understand the truth, no matter the cost. But with every passing second, the walls seemed to close in around them, and the feeling of being trapped in an inescapable web grew stronger. The dogs growled, and Robert's voice cut through the stillness. "You should have known better than to cross me, Faith. You should have known that there's no way out." Her chest tightened as the reality of their situation sank in. The fight wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for something much more precious, and it was slipping further out of her grasp with every passing moment. The darkness of the forest seemed to swallow them whole, every step they took now echoing louder in Faith's ears. The sound of the dog's paws against the ground grew nearer, the threat of capture imminent. Her thoughts scrambled. There was no time left to piece together the tangled web of lies and deceit that had led them here. She had no idea who was on her side and who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Sam's stance shifted, his eyes never leaving the masked man. Faith could feel the tension radiating from him, the quiet confidence that had kept them moving forward now replaced with an edge of desperation. He wasn't just fighting for their freedom anymore. He was fighting for the truth, whatever that might be. "Stay behind me," Sam whispered urgently to Faith, his voice barely audible over the growing noise of the dogs and the men closing in. Faith nodded, her hand gripping the back of his jacket as they continued to move cautiously through the underbrush. The masked man, still standing at a distance, studied them intently, his posture rigid and calculating. "You can't escape," he said again, his tone cold, almost detached. "The game has already been set in motion. There's no turning back now." Faith's mind raced. What game? What had they been part of that had been planned so meticulously, so deviously? And how did Robert fit into it all? Was he really the mastermind? Or had he been manipulated just as much as she had? The masked man continued, his words like daggers in the quiet night. "You think you're the heroes of this story, don't you? But you've been nothing but pawns in a much larger play." Fear rippled through Faith, but a spark of defiance burned brighter in her chest. She wasn't going to let this man define her story. She wasn't going to let anyone control her fate. Not anymore. "What do you want?" Faith's voice broke through the tension, louder than she expected, but it held a firmness that surprised even her. The man smirked, the glint in his eyes as sharp as a knife. "What do I want?" He chuckled, the sound low and eerie. "You really don't know, do you? I want everything you're running from. Everything you've been hiding from." His gaze shifted to Sam, his lips curling into a smile. "And I want him. He's the key to all of this." Faith's stomach twisted. She looked at Sam, his face unreadable, his jaw clenched tight. What was he hiding? What could he possibly be the key to? Before Faith could voice another question, the masked man signaled with his hand, and the dogs suddenly stopped in their tracks, their growls replaced with a tense silence. The stillness was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. A rustling from the trees snapped her attention to the left. Faith's breath caught in her throat as another figure stepped out of the shadows. This time, there was no mistaking the identity. It was Robert. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, his expression twisted into something dark, something unfamiliar. "Robert!" Faith gasped, her heart thudding in her chest. "What are you doing? Why are you working with them?" Robert's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief flash of hesitation passing through them, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced with a hardened, calculated gaze. "Faith, you don't understand. This isn't what you think." His voice was almost soft, as if he was trying to explain, but there was no mistaking the distance between them now, the divide that had grown so wide she couldn't see how they could ever bridge it. Faith shook her head, refusing to believe it. "You're working with these people, the ones who want to hurt us. You've been hunting me down for weeks, and now you're standing here like it's normal?" Robert's jaw clenched. "It's more complicated than that. I never wanted this for you, Faith, but I can't stop it now. Not after everything that's happened." His eyes flicked to the masked man, then back to Faith, filled with a mixture of regret and something darker. Sam stepped forward, his posture defiant. "You're lying," he said firmly. "You've been part of this from the beginning. Don't try to play the hero now." Robert's gaze shifted to Sam, narrowing. The air between them crackled with tension, as if the weight of their past together hung heavily in the balance. "I never asked for any of this," Robert muttered, his voice low but intense. "I was trying to protect you, to protect everyone, but sometimes you have to make a choice. And I've made mine." Faith's mind spun. What could be so important that Robert would risk everything? His own humanity, his relationship with her, for something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. What choice had he made, and why hadn't he told her the truth? "I don't want to be part of this anymore," Robert said, his eyes darkening. "But there's no way out. Not now." A sharp noise cut through the tension, the rustling of trees. A flash of movement, swift and silent. Faith's heart leaped into her throat as another figure appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. It was a woman, tall and slender, her face obscured by a mask similar to the one worn by the masked man. She was armed, holding a gun that glinted in the moonlight. Her presence was a cold reminder that the dangers they were facing weren't over, not by a long shot. "Robert," she said, her voice calm and unyielding. "It's time. The mission's already in motion. You can't back out now." Faith's eyes darted to Sam, then back to Robert. What was going on? What was this mission they kept talking about? "You should have stayed out of this, Faith," the woman continued, her eyes locking onto Faith with cold precision. "But now that you're here, we can't let you go. You'll never be able to walk away from this life. Not once you know the truth." A chill crept down Faith's spine. There was more at play here than she could have ever imagined, and she was only beginning to scratch the surface. Everything she thought she knew was being twisted, contorted into something she couldn't yet understand. "Get ready," Sam said quietly, his voice tense, "because things are about to get a lot worse." The air grew colder, thicker with each passing second. As the masked woman took a step closer, the sound of her boots crunching against the underbrush like a countdown to something inevitable. Faith's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions that had no clear answers. What had Robert gotten himself into? And what was this mission that had ensnared them all? Robert's eyes flickered to the woman, then back to Faith and Sam. There was a brief moment where it seemed like he might say something, anything, to clear the fog between them, but he remained silent. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, as though he had already made his peace with the choice he had made, however twisted it might be. "Do you realize what you're saying?" Faith asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts to steady it. She couldn't understand how the man she had trusted could be standing there, aligned with these people, with this woman, with the masked man. "Faith," Robert said, his voice strained, "I don't have a choice anymore. It's too late to turn back. I've done things, awful things, but I'm not a villain in this story. I'm just trying to survive. Just like you." Faith's hands were shaking as she clutched at Sam's jacket, as if his presence could anchor her to the truth she was desperately clinging to. She wanted to believe Robert, wanted to trust that he hadn't chosen this path willingly, but how could she? How could she when everything felt like a lie? When every new revelation only deepened the hole of confusion and betrayal? The woman took another step forward, her eyes never leaving Faith's. "It's not about survival, Robert. It never was. It's about power, control. And you," she pointed at Faith, her gloved finger sharp and accusatory. "You're a pawn in a game much larger than you realize." Faith recoiled, a cold shiver running through her. She wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Her thoughts were too jumbled, too afraid of what she might hear next. "Who are you people?" Sam growled, his voice breaking through the tension like a crack of thunder. "What is this all about?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes flickering to the masked man, who nodded once in her direction. She raised the gun, her movements deliberate, and Faith's heart skipped a beat as she instinctively took a step closer to Sam. "You still don't understand, do you?" the woman said, almost pityingly. "It's not about you. It's never been about you. But you're the key to everything, whether you want to be or not." Faith felt a sudden surge of panic. "The key to what?" The woman smirked, her eyes glinting with something dangerous. "To the plan. The one that's been in motion long before you were even born. The plan that's about to change everything." Sam's grip on Faith's arm tightened, pulling her closer as if to shield her from the threat. But the woman only laughed softly. "You think you can protect her, Sam? You've been protecting a lie." Faith felt her breath catch in her throat. Was Sam part of this too? Was he hiding something from her? Was anyone she knew actually who they claimed to be? The masked man stepped forward, his cold eyes locking onto hers. "You've been running from the truth, Faith. But there's nowhere left to hide. You're tangled up in this, whether you like it or not. And if you want to save anyone, you'll have to make a choice. A choice you won't like." "What choice?" Faith demanded, her voice rising. "What are you talking about?" But the man only smiled. "You'll see soon enough." A low, guttural growl echoed from the trees, and Faith froze. It wasn't the dogs this time. It was something much closer, something bigger. The silence stretched, unbearable, as the shadows around them seemed to pulse with life. And then, in an instant, the trees seemed to shift, the quiet air broken by the sound of something massive moving through the underbrush. It was a shadow, too large and too fast to be a mere animal. Faith's heart skipped a beat as the thing emerged from the trees. A creature of monstrous proportions, its glowing eyes fixated on them with a hunger that made her blood run cold. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered, his voice tight with fear. The masked woman didn't flinch. She barely seemed to acknowledge the creature as it stalked closer. "A reminder," she said simply, "of what happens when you defy the plan." The creature, some kind of twisted, terrifying beast, was almost upon them now, its massive form lumbering through the trees, its breath heavy and foul. Faith could see the rage in its eyes, the unnatural glow that didn't belong to any animal she had ever seen. "Run!" Sam yelled, shoving Faith forward, but her legs felt like stone. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The beast's eyes locked onto her, and it was as though the world stopped. It was no longer a mere danger. It was a force of nature, an inevitable destruction. You'll never escape, the woman said, her voice calm, as though the impending death surrounding them was simply a matter of fact. It's too late for you. And just as Faith thought she couldn't take any more, as the fear paralyzed her chest, a voice, a familiar voice, cut through the madness. Not if I can help it. Faith whipped around, her heart skipping. Robert was moving towards them, a strange device in his hand, glowing with an otherworldly light. His eyes were fierce, determined. He wasn't done. Not yet. And neither was she. Robert's sudden appearance, holding the glowing device, seemed to freeze time. The massive creature hesitated for just a split second, its glowing eyes flickering as though it too was trying to process what was happening. Faith stood motionless, her mind struggling to make sense of the impossible scene unfolding before her. Robert was here, but why? What had he done to bring this creature to a halt? Was it some kind of trap, or was he really trying to save them? The masked woman's face twisted with disbelief. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. Robert's jaw was clenched, his grip tightening around the device as he stepped closer. The glowing light from it pulsed, casting strange shadows across his face. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but there was a cold finality to it. I had no choice. The creature growled, its teeth bared in a deadly snarl, but it didn't move closer. It seemed disoriented, as if the device Robert held was having an effect on it, an effect Faith couldn't comprehend. The woman stepped forward, fury flashing in her eyes. You think you can control it? You're just as weak as the rest of them. But Robert didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, his focus unbroken. I've been weak for far too long, he said quietly, as if the words were more for himself than for anyone else. He looked at Faith then, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his eyes softened. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to come to this. Faith felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. Robert had chosen this path, yes, but he was finally taking responsibility for the mess he had created. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to hide. And yet, the tension hadn't broken. The creature was still looming, the masked woman still standing, every movement full of menace. The device in Robert's hand buzzed loudly, and Faith instinctively took a step back, her heart racing again. The masked woman scowled. You don't understand, she hissed. You're only prolonging the inevitable. Sam looked between the two, then at the creature, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. What is this? What's happening? He demanded. Robert shook his head. It's over, Sam. It has to be. For all of us. He pressed a button on the device, and the light grew brighter, its hum rising to a high-pitched whine. The creature's body trembled, as if it was caught in a war between its primal instincts and something far more powerful. The air itself seemed to bend around them, heavy with the weight of what was unfolding. The masked woman stepped back, eyes darting nervously, but she didn't make a move to stop Robert. Faith's mind raced. This was it, the moment of truth. Robert had finally made a choice, but the question remained. Would it be enough? The creature snarled one last time before suddenly collapsing to the ground with a deafening roar, the energy in the air vanishing in an instant. Faith's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, everything was still. The woman stared at the fallen beast, her face twisted in shock, before her eyes shot back to Robert, her hands trembling with barely contained rage. No, she growled, her voice low and dangerous. This wasn't supposed to happen. You weren't supposed to destroy it. Robert didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the creature, now motionless, a deep sorrow etched across his face. He wasn't smiling, wasn't relieved. He was simply exhausted. He had given everything to this moment. Then, as if out of nowhere, a final twist of fate caught them all off guard. The woman's mask shattered, falling to the ground with a hollow thud. She didn't flinch at the sound, but Faith couldn't tear her gaze away from the face that was now revealed. It was a face Faith knew all too well, a face she had seen in photographs, in memories that she had long buried. It was her own. Faith's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding wildly as her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. The woman who had been leading them all this time, who had been threatening their lives, their safety, their very futures, was a mirror image of her. No, that can't be. But it was. The woman, her doppelganger, stared at Faith, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Surprised? Faith? You shouldn't be. You were always meant for more than you realized. Robert's eyes widened as he looked between them. It can't be your... Faith couldn't speak. Her mind was whirling, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in the most horrifying way. Her entire life, all the chaos, all the danger, had been orchestrated around her. But why? Why her? The woman, the other Faith, laughed softly, her voice mocking. You've always been the key, haven't you? Always at the center of everything. But don't worry, you'll understand soon enough. After all, this game is just beginning. Before Faith could react, before she could process what she had just heard, the ground beneath them began to tremble, the sound of distant engines rumbling ominously. The woman turned, her eyes locking onto Robert with a finality that chilled Faith to the bone. You've won this round, the woman said, her voice cold, filled with venom. But the war isn't over. With that, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the remnants of a life Faith had thought she understood. But now, she realized with a chilling certainty, nothing would ever be the same again. Faith stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the echoes of the woman's words lingered in the air. The rumbling of the ground grew louder, more frantic, and a deep sense of dread settled in her stomach. Robert, still holding the device that had stopped the creature, slowly turned toward her, his expression unreadable. He looked as if he had been fighting a battle inside himself for much longer than this one moment, and now, the weight of the truth was starting to settle on his shoulders. The room around them began to shake, the walls creaking under the pressure of some unseen force. It was as though the very earth was responding to the threat that had just been unleashed. Faith could feel the air thickening with tension, the quiet hum of danger growing louder with each passing second. I didn't know, Robert said, his voice strained. I didn't know it would end like this. I thought I could fix everything. Faith turned to him, her mind still reeling. Fix everything? What do you mean, Robert? What did she mean that I'm the key? Robert's eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and regret. Faith, there's so much more to this than you realize. You've been part of something far bigger than you ever knew. The creature, it wasn't just a random force. It was connected to her, to you, to everything that's been happening. I thought I could stop it, but now I see that I've only made things worse. The rumbling grew louder still, and Faith's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the chaos around them. What did Robert mean by all of this? How could she be the key to something she didn't even understand? Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shook violently, sending both Faith and Robert stumbling. The walls cracked, and the ceiling above them groaned in protest as if it were on the verge of collapsing. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and something foul, as if the very building they were in was beginning to buckle under the pressure of the forces that had been unleashed. Robert! Faith shouted over the noise, grabbing his arm. We need to get out of here. Now. But Robert's eyes were distant, as though he was seeing something far beyond the present moment. It's too late, he muttered, almost to himself. There's nowhere to run. We're already too deep in it. Faith felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to accept that this was the end. What do you mean, too deep? We can't just give up. We have to fight. Before Robert could respond, a deafening crash sounded from somewhere deeper within the building, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver of terror through Faith's body. The creature, the one they thought had been vanquished, was back. But it was different now. It was no longer the massive, menacing figure they had faced before. This time, it was changing. The glow that had once been so bright was now a dark, swirling mass of energy, shifting and writhing as if it were alive in a way that defied all logic. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, its body rippling with an unnatural force. Faith took a step back, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. It was no longer just a monster. It was something far more sinister, something that was tied to her very existence. Get back, Robert shouted, pulling Faith behind him as the creature surged forward, its eyes burning with an eerie, unnatural light. We have to stop it before it consumes everything. Faith's heart raced. Stop it? How? We don't even know what it is anymore. Robert's face was filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. It's a part of you, Faith. You don't understand yet, but you're the only one who can destroy it. Her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? I'm the only one. I don't even know what it is. But before Robert could answer, the ground shook again, this time with such force that the walls cracked wide open. The creature was drawing nearer, its form becoming more unstable with each passing moment. Faith could feel its presence closing in, and for a brief moment, all she could think about was how helpless she felt. The world around her was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. And then, she felt it. The faintest pull, like a thread connecting her to the creature. It wasn't just fear that bound her to it. It was something deeper, something primal. The woman's words echoed in her mind, the ones that had sent a chill down her spine. You were always meant for more than you realized. Faith's pulse quickened. She didn't know how or why, but somehow, she knew what she had to do. Robert, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I think I understand. He turned to her, confusion and concern flickering in his eyes. Understand what? I'm the key, she said, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her. I'm the one who can stop it. Robert's eyes widened, but before he could respond, the creature surged toward them with a speed that was almost unimaginable. Faith stepped forward, her hand trembling as she raised it toward the creature. The connection between them, whatever it was, pulsed more intensely now, and for the first time, Faith felt an overwhelming sense of power surge within her. But there was no time to think, no time to second-guess herself. The creature was upon them. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Faith reached deep within herself, calling on that mysterious force that had awakened inside her. The air around her shimmered as if reality itself was bending, warping under the weight of her power. Her hand extended outward, and in that moment, the creature halted, its monstrous form quivering in the air as if caught in an unseen force. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, the creature let out a final, horrific scream, its body beginning to collapse in on itself as if being sucked into the very fabric of the universe. The ground beneath them cracked wide open, a swirling vortex of light and darkness consuming everything in its path. Faith stood there, her hand still raised, her body trembling with the effort it had taken to hold the creature at bay. But as the vortex intensified, she realized that her connection to it wasn't just about stopping it. It was about something else, something far greater. The ground shook one last time before everything went dark, and in that darkness, Faith finally understood what she had to do. The war was just beginning, but now, she was ready. The darkness was overwhelming, pressing in from all sides, suffocating everything around Faith. But somehow, in the midst of it all, there was a light. A soft glow, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. It was as if the universe itself was pulling her from the depths of this void, offering her a chance to see beyond the fear and chaos. Her heart raced as she felt the pull of that light, something deep within her urging her to move toward it. She didn't know how long she had been in the darkness, or if time even mattered anymore. What mattered was the feeling, the realization that she had the power to control it all. Her power, her connection to the creature, to this world, to everything. Slowly, the light began to take shape. The swirling darkness around her began to dissipate, revealing the remnants of the battle she had just fought. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, scorched, but the creature was gone. The air was still, eerily so, but the weight of the tension had lifted. Faith blinked, her eyes adjusting to the newfound clarity. She looked around, and for the first time since this all began, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't over. No, the battle wasn't done. But the chaos, the destruction, the creature, it was gone. The balance had shifted, and it was up to her to maintain it. Robert stood beside her, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had been watching her, waiting for this moment, but even he hadn't known what would happen next. You did it, he said, his voice low and steady, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. Faith nodded, feeling the exhaustion settling into her bones. But there was something else there too, a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She wasn't just a victim of fate. She was the one who had brought about the change. And now, she had the power to shape the future. As the ground beneath them continued to settle, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon. The world outside, once full of shadows and terror, was now bathed in the gentle glow of a new day. And for the first time in a long while, Faith felt hope. But there was something else, a lingering thought, a question that still burned at the back of her mind. What had the woman meant when she said that faith was the key? How had this all come to pass? The mysteries weren't gone. They were still waiting to be uncovered, but Faith knew that she was ready to face them. Robert stepped closer, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something unspoken. We have a lot to figure out, he said, looking down at the ground as if he was weighing his next words carefully. But you've changed everything. Faith turned to him, her gaze firm and resolute. I didn't do it alone, she said. There's still so much we need to understand. But this is just the beginning. The silence between them was filled with the weight of their shared journey, the hardships they had endured, and the uncertain road ahead. But Faith was no longer afraid. She was the one who had broken the cycle, the one who had fought back against the darkness. And now, she had a new understanding of her role in the grand scheme of things. She wasn't just an ordinary woman thrown into an extraordinary situation. She had a purpose, a mission, and it was one she intended to see through to the end. But as they walked away from the remnants of the destroyed building, the world around them shifting and changing, Faith couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, something bigger than they had yet encountered. The creature might be gone for now, but the forces that had caused its rise were still at play, and she would need to be ready for whatever came next. As they stepped into the light of the new day, a deep sense of responsibility settled over Faith. She had fought the darkness and won, but there was more at stake than her own survival. There were others out there, people she had never met, whose fates were intertwined with hers. The path ahead wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. She was ready for whatever came next. The world, it seemed, was still on the brink of something unimaginable, and Faith, the once abandoned child, was now its protector. Her journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. She could feel it, the stirring of something deep within her, the knowledge that she was destined for more than she had ever thought possible. The future, full of uncertainty, was now in her hands. With every step she took, she was carving a path toward something greater, something that would change the world forever. As the final echoes of the battle faded into the distance, Faith knew that this was just the first chapter of a story that would span lifetimes. A story of redemption, of power, and of a future that could be rewritten. And as she walked forward, her heart filled with determination, one thing was clear. No matter what came next, she would be ready. The darkness would never return, not as long as she stood in its way. The journey was far from over. It had only just begun. As Faith and Robert continued their journey, the weight of what they had just endured still lingered in the air. They walked side by side, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were both changed, both irrevocably altered by the events that had unfolded in the last few days. Yet, in the midst of it all, Faith found herself thinking of the future, of what they could do now that the world had been given another chance. The landscape around them was slowly beginning to heal, as though the earth itself was responding to the restoration of balance. The air felt fresher, the light brighter, and the sense of dread that had once permeated every corner of their world was beginning to fade. But still, the mysteries loomed. Faith couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of curiosity. The questions that had been planted in her mind by the strange woman, by the mysterious creature, and by the cryptic forces surrounding her still remained unanswered. What had she truly unlocked? What was the deeper meaning behind everything that had happened? And what of the key the woman had spoken of? She had no clear answers, but one thing was certain. Her journey was far from over. As they reached the edge of the city, Robert spoke up, breaking the silence between them. "We need to go to the library," he said, his voice tinged with a sense of urgency. "There are things I need to show you." Faith glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The library?" she repeated, unsure what he meant. But something in his voice told her that this wasn't just about finding answers. This was about preparing for what was to come. He nodded, his face serious. "There's more to this, more than we even know, and I think it's time we learn everything we can." Faith felt a chill run through her, but the determination in Robert's eyes only spurred her forward. Whatever was coming, they were going to face it together. And whatever knowledge lay hidden in the dusty old tomes of the library, it would be their key to understanding the true scope of the power they had uncovered. They made their way toward the ancient library on the outskirts of town, an imposing building that had stood for centuries. The doors creaked open as they entered, and the scent of old paper and leather filled the air. Robert led her through rows of towering shelves, his fingers grazing the spines of books as if searching for something specific. Finally, he stopped in front of a massive tome, its cover adorned with strange symbols and worn with age. He gently lifted it from the shelf and handed it to Faith. "This is it," he said, his voice almost reverent. "This will tell you everything." Faith hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the book in her hands. She could sense the power it contained, the knowledge that had been hidden away for so long. As she opened the first page, the letters seemed to shift and change before her eyes, almost as if the book was alive, responding to her touch. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages quickly, absorbing the information like a sponge. The words spoke of ancient forces, of forgotten powers that had shaped the world, and of a prophecy that had been buried in the sands of time. It spoke of the key that Faith had unknowingly become, the one who would stand against the coming darkness. Her heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. She was no longer just a survivor of a cruel fate. She was the chosen one, the one destined to stop the cycle of destruction. But what did that truly mean? And who, or what, was she up against? As Faith read on, the book revealed an unexpected twist. There was another force at play, one that had been quietly waiting in the shadows for centuries. The creature she had fought was merely a pawn in a much larger game. The true enemy, the one who would stop at nothing to destroy everything, was still out there, lurking in the darkness. Faith's blood ran cold. She had thought that the battle was over, that she had done what was necessary. But the truth was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. She closed the book slowly, her mind racing. The enemy they were about to face was more powerful, more dangerous than anything she could have prepared for. And yet, she knew, deep down, that this was her calling. She had already faced the darkness and won. She would do it again. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. She turned to Robert, who had been watching her silently as she processed the revelation. His face was grim, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice low. Faith nodded, her gaze steady and determined. "We've come this far," she said quietly, "and we're going to see it through to the end." The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Faith had unlocked a power within herself that was capable of overcoming any darkness. She was no longer the abandoned child left to fend for herself on Christmas Eve. She was a warrior, a protector, and the key to saving the world from the forces that threatened to destroy it. As she stepped away from the library and into the light of a new day, Faith knew that her true journey was only just beginning. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight, but she was ready. Because the greatest strength wasn't in her power alone. It was in her ability to stand up, to fight for what was right, and to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The world wasn't safe yet, but Faith had become its greatest hope. And as long as she drew breath, she would continue to fight, until the darkness was no more. And so, the story of Faith, the abandoned child who grew up to save lives, would never truly end. It would live on, as long as there was hope, as long as there was light to fight against the dark. For Faith had become more than just a survivor. She had become a symbol of resilience, of courage, and of the unbreakable spirit that could change the world.